VFX. Looks pretty, but can be a bit of a nightmare to manage. The larger your project grows, the more you end up needing to make new textures or materials or even multiple custom shaders scattered across your project. I mean, come on, who needs 7 smoke materials? What if you could make an absolute ton of amazing effects using just one very basic shader, a texture, and one material? Well, you can, because that's what this video is all about. Okay, my use of infinite here is pretty clickbaity, but it's pretty close. Let's start with a completely blank scene, just so you know I'm not cheating. I am using URP, but HDRP will have a similar setup. A big chunk of this will be handled by a particle system, so we'll need one of those. And just for some visual clarity here, I'm going to turn off the selection outline, and I'll also disable the skybox. Now for the particle system, to not clutter the view, let's change some of the settings here to make sure it's only spawning one particle. So we'll turn the shape off, change emission over life to 0, add a burst of 1, and put the speed down to 0. So the main part to tackle is, how do you get one material to have a lot of textures? And that's the easy bit. It's a sprite sheet. The one I'll be using is a 4x4 at 2K res, meaning this one texture is the equivalent of 16 separate 512 by 512 textures. And look, you don't have to have all the answers right away. You can start by adding in the particle textures you know you'll use, and just keep populating the other cells as time goes on. You'll usually want to disable the sRGB checkbox here. Do this for anything that's used as a mask or only contains grayscale data. And you'll also notice that I have the alpha source set to none, which may seem odd, but it'll make sense in a few minutes. We'll actually go ahead and start fresh in a new folder, and I'll just duplicate this sprite sheet texture into this as well. And since we're focusing on the particle system side for now, we don't actually need to touch any shader stuff yet. And it will also help demonstrate some pros and cons. So I'll use a default Unity particle material for this, and while there are a bajillion of them, they have at least improved the pipeline-specific particle materials. So if you're on URP, just head to their particle selection and choose Unlit. Slap the texture in, and then drag that material onto the particle system. First problem, there's no alpha, which makes sense because we haven't enabled it on the material, and also about 30 seconds ago I said have the alpha source set to none, which may seem odd, but it'll make sense in a few minutes. Well, we're still not at the point where it makes sense, but since we're not using a custom shader for now, I can go ahead and set this to alpha from grayscale. For the filter mode, it's often a good idea to set it to point whenever you're having to deal with sprite sheets. This helps to avoid textures bleeding into the other cells. And so let's enable transparency on the material. And now we've got something, 16 of something, whereas we only want 1. So without any custom shader, you do have some nice options here, but our goal is to actually drop the options from the material and handle it all in the particle system, including the emission. This is what helps us reduce the need to create loads of separate materials for different VFX. So for now, let's head over to the particle system itself, and what we want to do is enable texture sheet animation. Then specify your grid size, and for us that's a 4x4. And if we were to hit play on that, you can see it's just cycling through all the cells, which is handy for actual texture sheet animations, but not so much for us. So let's say, for example, that we want this to be our first example of smoke. So what you want to do is come down to the frame over time and just choose the leftmost option, which just sets both the start and end curve to the top. And once we do that, we can now change the start frame, and it will only show that specific cell on our grid. Very cool. So you can see where we're going with this. We can duplicate this particle system out, change the number it starts on, and boom, whirlwind. I'll be right back once I've got them all arranged in the scene here. So here they are. All of the individual grid cells are now their own particle system. Nothing is properly animated with the particle system, of course, but it's just a starting point. So let's take a look at what sort of control we have with the default Unity material. We can change the color on the particle system, which is, standard stuff. We can also control the alpha. Again, pretty standard stuff. And those two things alone can give you a lot of range without having to do custom shaders, but you'll hit a limit pretty quickly. The most that we can really do with this thing is to make different colored versions of the textures that you have without having to make any new materials. What we can't do is control the emission, And there's also nothing special in terms of like particle softness. I believe this does exist on the lit version, but unlit particles in almost all games is still pretty much the standard. So the emission issue, or the emission, if you're into that, ignoring the lack of bloom post-processing that we have in the scene, we can at least enable this on the material, but then it affects all the particles that share this material. There are some workarounds, I guess, like setting the material to the max emissive value that you'd want, and then just making sure each particle had, either toned down alpha or color or both to like compensate for that value on the material. But that's nasty, and it also has a pretty big problem. Because you see, the emission color is handled separately on the material. So if you wanted glowing particles, and you do want glowing particles, you won't be able to override the color on the particle system anymore. This in turn leads you back to the problem that we're trying to solve, in that you'll need different materials for each different color of emission that you want. So obviously that's a no-go. And as one final example to drive this point home, let's go back to the actual VFX examples. All of this is available for download on my Patreon, by the way, any support helps, and see it with the default material on. You can see how much of a killer that lack of emission control really is. So let's say goodbye to that, hello to blinding pink, and then make a new unlit shader graph. We'll need a texture 2D property, call it whatever you want, then get down a sample texture 2D node and hook it in. Then we'll add a color property, and I will eventually change this out for something even better, but if you wanted just like a basic setup with a lot of range, then this is the way. Multiply that with the texture node, but instead of RGBA output, I'm going to choose the green channel as it contains the least amount of compression. And it also finally answers that age-old mystery from the past. Have the alpha source set to none, which may seem odd, but it'll make sense in a few minutes. Well done, folks. We got there in the end. So now you can disable the alpha from grayscale option, which will save you the tiniest amount of GPU resources. Every little helps. Now for the integration with the particle system, and that's as simple as adding in a vertex color node and just multiplying it into the chain. And that's the base color done. Time for the alpha now. It's not enabled on the shader by default, so just come to the graph settings and change it to transparent. Now we have an extra slot to hook into. We want to multiply the same green channel by the vertex color that we already have, but we need it to be the alpha channel of the vertex color. So add in a split node here, output the alpha into a new multiply, slot the green channel in, and that's it. Just hook the result into the alpha. Lastly, because I forgot before, come to the color property and on the node settings, change it to a HDR mode. This is what will give us the emission. And that's it. So save it, then right click on the shader and create a material from it. And let's get it on all the VFX here before my retinas completely burn out. Assign the texture on the material, and there we are. At the moment it looks very similar to the Unity default option, but have no worries, because while we can control the emission here on the material like we could before, we're only using one color property, which means we can have both emission and different colors, and that's already a huge win. You can do a lot with just this. But we can win even more if you're interested. Instead of a HDR range on the material, we can put it directly into the particle system, meaning we get like true control over each particle's intensity without weird workarounds or compromises. So let's hop back to the shader, say goodbye to the color property that we made, and say hello to a UV node. Then we'll split this out, and if this makes you scratch your head in complete confusion, just come back to the particle system for a second and enable custom vertex streams. I've already set this up on mine, so let me just remove this last entry here, and that's what you would see by default. If you look at the UV text code 0, it's showing X and Y in use, meaning Z and W are still free for the taking. And to confuse you even more, in order to get access to the Z, we need to come here, add a custom, and choose custom1.x. This is really not user-friendly, but the reason this works is because X is already taken, so it's just giving us the next unused channel, which, as you can see here, is the Z. So if RGBA equals XYZW, then B equals Z. No more questions, stick the B output in the multiply and save the shader. In order to use this channel though, we need to come here to the custom data property and choose vector. And again, I've already got this set up, so let me just switch this back to how it would look for you. 4 channels and all 0. We only have one custom channel though, so we set the vector type to 1 and Bob's your uncle. Or your aunt these days actually, that's fine too. And that's it basically for emissive control. You can now just pump this number up or down depending on if you wanted that specific particle to glow or not. No need for messing with color or alpha values to level things out. Each texture now has completely standalone control from the others, which you can tell by looking at a material. It's just a texture. How beautiful is that? You know what else is beautiful? VFX kits. And that's basically what you'll end up with as soon as you add in some simple particle animation to each of these textures. You can then just keep going with it, making all sorts of other effects, all utilizing the exact same sprite sheet. And if you're wondering whether or not it's more efficient to just use smaller individual textures instead of using one giant one, that's going to be context dependent, but I can tell you that extra material batches and texture switches are not a thing if you can stick with this workflow. And that will save you in the long run for sure. I'm not saying you need to do this for all of your VFX, but where you can, it would be a smart move. But anyway, back to this, sort of the entire point, like being able to create many new and different VFX for no additional costs. That's pretty cool, right? Like no other shaders, no new materials, no new textures, just bliss, pure bliss. You know what isn't cool though? Particles clipping through geometry. So since we have our own particle shader, we have the freedom to add in whatever cool things we want. And let's end this video off with one of the more common VFX features, depth blending. The problem is simple. Particles are just textures on quads, and when those quads intersect other geometry, you get an obvious cutoff. For some things this is fine, but for things like haze or smokes or fog, it is a real bummer. So let's fix it. You'll first need to come to your rendering pipeline settings and make sure depth texture is enabled. Otherwise, you're going to be screaming at me in the comments about how you followed the shader exactly, but it's not working for you. I'm telling you, buddy, go enable that setting. So now into the shader again. All we want to do is take the raw screen position and subtract it by the scene depth with a value to determine how much. And that's all. So let's go ahead and add a scene depth node. Set it to I instead of linear, then plop down a screen position node, which is basically the UVs of the entire screen, and we want to set this to raw. We do need to split this on the W though, because we only care about depth, and if you remember from before, if RGBA equals XYZW, then A equals W, no more questions, thank you. And then just subtract that and the scene depth. And now we just need the value to change so we can decide how soft they are. And you could put this on the particle system as well, but I'm leaving this on the material just as an example. So multiply this by a float property, saturate it, and then multiply it into the existing alpha chain. All done. Save the shader and go check it out. Like that is much smoother on the eyes, and if you are struggling to see the difference because I chose the messiest example I could have, let me just take it out of the shader for a second and save that. You see? All ugly and nasty like. Plug it back in. Much better. And that's it for this video, I'm afraid. As I have mentioned, all the source files, including an extra sprite sheet, are available over on my Patreon. Any support helps out massively, like even if it's just leaving a like or a very nice, super kind comment on this video. Yeah, anything. But thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.